James Baker wasn't a man of superstitions. He believed in logic, in things he could touch and understand. That was probably why he felt no hesitation when he stumbled upon the painting at a dusty antique store, tucked away in a forgotten corner, as if it had been deliberately hidden. The figure in the painting, a pale woman dressed in a tattered gown, seemed to call out to him. Her eyes, too lifelike for comfort, almost begged him to take her home. The store owner didn't even charge much, eager to get rid of it. "It brings bad luck," she had said. James brushed it off as an old woman's ramblings. Back at home, the painting found a place in his living room. At first, it was just a decoration, a conversation starter at best. But as days passed, something about it began to unsettle him. The figure's eyes, no matter where he stood in the room, seemed to follow him. It was probably just an optical illusion, he convinced himself. He told his girlfriend, Sarah, about it, and she laughed, calling him paranoid. But even Sarah seemed to avoid looking directly at the painting after a while. The first real sign that something was wrong came late one night. James had been watching TV, struggling to stay awake, when he noticed it, movement out of the corner of his eye. The figure in the painting had shifted, ever so slightly. Her gaze no longer met his, it was focused on the front door. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, she was back to normal. Must have been a trick of the light, he thought, and forced himself to go to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. His dreams were haunted by the woman in the painting, her face gaunt, her lips moving as if trying to speak. In the dream, she was not alone. Behind her, shadowy figures loomed, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. When he awoke, heart pounding in his chest, he was certain he'd heard whispering, soft but distinct, coming from the living room. The following morning, James inspected the painting closely. The woman's expression had changed. Subtly, yes, but it was different. Her mouth, once closed, now hung slightly open, as if frozen mid-sentence. That was impossible. Paintings didn't just change. But there it was, staring back at him, daring him to question his own sanity. James tried to ignore the changes in the painting, chalking it up to exhaustion and stress from work. But the more he tried, the more the painting seemed to demand his attention. Every time he passed by, the figure seemed a little different. Her face grew paler, her eyes darker, and her expression more desperate. Sarah noticed it too. One evening, as they were sitting together, she pointed it out. "Was her dress always that torn?" she asked, her voice shaky. James hadn't even noticed until she mentioned it. The gown the woman wore was indeed more ragged than before, as if it had deteriorated along with her haunting expression. That night, the house felt suffocating. The air was heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. James tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. When he finally drifted off to sleep, it was only to find himself back in the same nightmare. The woman in the painting was no longer alone. This time, the shadowy figures were clearer. They weren't just standing behind her, they were reaching out, their long, skeletal hands inching toward the front of the canvas, as if trying to break free. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, and immediately felt the cold, oppressive air around him. The whispering was louder now, not a figment of his imagination. He crept downstairs, his heart pounding in his ears, and there it was, the painting, the woman now standing, no longer seated as she had been. Her arms were outstretched, as if beckoning him closer, her eyes wide with panic. The figures behind her had grown bolder, their outlines sharper, more defined. James stood frozen, unable to look away. Sarah came downstairs a moment later, rubbing her eyes. "James? What are you doing?" she asked, her voice breaking the trance. He pointed to the painting, his words failing him. But when she looked, the woman was seated once more, her arms folded delicately in her lap. "You're freaking me out," Sarah muttered, walking back upstairs, leaving James alone with the painting, and the unshakable feeling that it was playing a cruel game with him. The next day, James called in sick to work. He couldn't focus on anything but the painting. He spent hours researching its origins, hoping to find some logical explanation. His search led him down dark rabbit holes, stories of cursed objects, haunted paintings, and the fates of those who dared keep them. None of the stories ended well. In particular, he found a case eerily similar to his own, a painting of a woman that reportedly caused its owners to suffer from hallucinations, nightmares, and eventually, death. That evening, James sat in front of the painting, determined to watch it, to catch it in the act. Hours passed in silence, and just when he began to think he was going mad, the woman moved again. This time, it wasn't subtle. Her head tilted, her eyes shifting to meet his directly. She smiled, a slow, sinister curl of her lips that sent chills down his spine. Panicked, James grabbed the painting, intending to destroy it, but the moment his hands touched the frame, a searing pain shot through his body, dropping him to his knees. He gasped, clutching his chest, the pain so intense he could barely breathe. And just as quickly as it had come, it was gone, leaving him shaken and terrified. The painting remained untouched on the wall, mocking him. Desperation took hold. James knew he had to get rid of it, but every time he tried, something stopped him. Whether it was a sudden illness, an unexpected visitor, or a freak accident, something always intervened. It was as if the painting wouldn't allow him to part with it. The final straw came when Sarah left. She couldn't handle the tension, the fear that had gripped their lives since the painting arrived. "I can't stay here anymore, James," she said, her voice trembling. "That thing, it's ruining us." And with that, she was gone, leaving him alone with the cursed painting and the creeping dread that he was next. After Sarah left, the house felt colder, more hostile. James had never believed in supernatural forces, but now, it seemed like his life was unraveling, one thread at a time. Days blurred into nights, and his grip on reality started to slip. He barely left the house anymore, afraid of what the painting might do while he was gone. The whispers that once only haunted his dreams now echoed throughout the halls, growing louder each day. They called his name, begging him to come closer, to look deeper into the eyes of the woman in the painting. His phone calls to Sarah went unanswered. She had made it clear that she wouldn't return until the painting was gone, but James knew deep down that it wasn't that simple. He had tried everything, contacting art dealers, even calling in a priest, but no one could help. The few who saw the painting reacted with a mix of horror and disbelief, as though they could feel the evil radiating from it. Yet none dared offer a solution. It was as if the painting had a will of its own, trapping anyone who came near. As the days passed, James began to notice strange occurrences around the house. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered unpredictably, and the temperature dropped to freezing despite the summer heat outside. He found doors unlocked, windows open, and once, his front door stood wide open in the middle of the night. He began locking everything, but the house had a way of defying him, always one step ahead. It was as if the painting was gaining control, not just over him, but over the entire house. One evening, as James sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the cursed painting, he heard a soft knock at the door. At first, he ignored it, convinced it was just another hallucination. But the knocking persisted, louder and more insistent. Reluctantly, he stood up and approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. When he opened it, no one was there. The street was empty, bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights. But when he turned back, his blood ran cold. The woman in the painting was no longer inside the frame. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. He felt her presence, a heavy, oppressive energy that filled the air. She was here, in the house, somewhere. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he backed away, his eyes darting to every shadow. And then, in the reflection of a nearby mirror, he saw her. She stood at the far end of the hallway, her figure pale and ghostly, the tattered gown hanging loosely from her frame. Her eyes were locked on his, dark and empty, yet filled with a malevolent hunger. James stumbled backward, knocking over a table as he tried to escape. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it a hallucination? A dream? But deep down, he knew the truth. The woman in the painting had escaped, and now she was free to roam. His house had become her prison, and he was her captive. For the next few days, James barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt her watching him, lurking in the shadows. He heard her footsteps echoing through the halls at night, soft but unmistakable. Sometimes, he even caught glimpses of her out of the corner of his eye, always there, always waiting. He couldn't escape her. His friends noticed his decline. They came to check on him, concerned by his disheveled appearance and paranoid behavior. But James knew better than to let them inside. He didn't want them to see what he had become. He didn't want them to meet her. One by one, they stopped calling, stopped visiting, leaving him isolated and alone. It was better this way. No one else needed to suffer because of his mistake. As time wore on, the woman became bolder. She no longer hid in the shadows, she appeared in full view, standing at the foot of his bed, watching him sleep, or hovering near the windows, her hollow eyes fixed on the world outside. She never spoke, but James didn't need words to understand her intentions. She wanted him. And soon, she would take him. One night, after yet another sleepless evening, James made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. He had to find a way to destroy the painting, to rid himself of her for good. He searched the internet for any possible solution, rituals, exorcisms, anything that could sever the bond between him and the cursed artwork. But no matter how deep he dug, the answers always led back to one conclusion: the painting had to be destroyed, and with it, its spirit. With trembling hands, James grabbed a can of gasoline from the garage. He doused the painting, watching the liquid soak into the canvas, pooling at the base of the frame. His heart pounded in his chest as he lit a match, the flame flickering in the dim light of the living room. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Could this really work? Would it finally free him from her torment? Before he could drop the match, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air around him turned icy cold, and he felt her presence, stronger than ever. Slowly, he turned to face the painting, and his blood froze. The woman's eyes, once hollow and lifeless, were now filled with rage. Her figure stretched and distorted within the frame, reaching out toward him, her fingers elongated and sharp. The match slipped from his fingers, extinguished before it hit the ground. He backed away, stumbling over the furniture, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew, without a doubt, that she wouldn't let him destroy her. She wouldn't let him escape. James was trapped. The woman in the painting, her presence now undeniable, had fully taken over his home, and perhaps, his mind. The walls seemed to pulse with the same malevolent energy that radiated from the cursed artwork. Every corner of the house felt haunted, oppressive, as if she was everywhere and nowhere at once. He could no longer tell where she ended and where he began. His thoughts, once clear and rational, were now muddled with paranoia and fear. He couldn't think straight, couldn't focus on anything but her. He began hearing her voice, soft at first, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. But as the days wore on, her voice grew louder, more insistent. She called to him, urging him to come closer to the painting, to give in to the madness that was slowly consuming him. Sometimes, he could feel her breath on his neck, the cold touch of her hand on his shoulder. Each time, it sent a wave of terror through his body. He couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, James called Sarah. His voice cracked with fear as he begged her to return, to help him get rid of the painting once and for all. But Sarah was firm. "I can't, James. Not until that thing is gone," she said, her voice filled with guilt. She had tried to help him before, but now, she knew it was too dangerous. "Please, James. You need to get out of that house." But leaving wasn't an option. The painting had a hold on him now, and no matter how hard he tried to run, he knew it would follow. He had seen what it could do. It wouldn't stop until it had consumed him entirely. One night, as James sat in the living room, staring at the cursed painting, something changed. The whispering stopped, and the house fell into an eerie silence. For the first time in days, he couldn't feel her presence. The air was still, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that it was over, that maybe, somehow, the curse had lifted. But as he stood to leave the room, he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He doubled over, gasping for air, clutching his heart as the pain intensified. His vision blurred, and the room around him seemed to distort, warping into something unfamiliar. Through the haze, he saw her. The woman in the painting had stepped out of the frame, her ghostly figure now standing before him, her eyes filled with a dark, unholy power. She smiled, a cold, malevolent grin that sent waves of terror through his body. "You belong to me now," she whispered, her voice no longer distant, but right beside his ear. James tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He was frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming force of her presence. She reached out, her fingers cold as ice as they wrapped around his wrist, pulling him closer. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in as the darkness consumed him. He felt himself slipping away, losing his grip on reality, on life itself. But in that final moment, just as he was about to surrender, something inside him snapped. With a surge of adrenaline, he yanked his arm free from her grip, stumbling backward into the wall. His eyes locked onto the painting, now empty, its once cursed figure standing inches from him, more real than ever. He couldn't destroy it, but maybe he could trap her back inside. With the last bit of strength he had, James grabbed the painting from the wall, holding it in front of him like a shield. The woman's ghostly figure loomed over him, her hands reaching out, but James held firm. "Get back," he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Go back where you came from." For a brief moment, the woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if weighing his words. And then, slowly, she began to dissolve, her figure fading into the air like mist. James watched in disbelief as she was pulled back into the painting, her form becoming once again trapped within the confines of the canvas. Her face, now twisted in rage, glared out at him from the painting, but she was trapped. For now. Exhausted and trembling, James dropped the painting to the floor, falling to his knees. His heart raced, his body drenched in sweat. He had survived, but just barely. The painting still held its curse, and the woman inside was still very much alive. He knew that this wasn't over, that as long as the painting existed, she would always be waiting, biding her time. The next morning, James packed his belongings and left the house, leaving the cursed painting behind. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The house, the painting, the woman, everything about it was tainted, and he had no intention of returning. As he drove away, he felt a strange mix of relief and dread, knowing that while he had escaped for now, the curse still lingered. Somewhere, in the darkened halls of that house, the painting remained. And one day, someone else would find it. Someone else would take it home, just as he had. And the cycle would begin again.